It is the silence. Deep beneath the mountains of West Virginia, more than 1,000 feet below the frozen winter ground, the coal seam stretches through the darkness like a buried river of black stone. The air is thick with dust and the smell of oil from the machines that have been grinding steadily since before sunrise. Electric cutting machines scream against the coal face. Steel carts rattle along narrow rails. Lamps swing from the helmets of men who have learned to live their lives in the narrow corridors carved beneath the earth. It is early morning, December 6, 1907. Inside the Monongah coal mine, hundreds of men move through the tunnels with practiced rhythm. Many are immigrants, Italians, Hungarians, Poles, drawn to the coalfields by the promise of wages that could feed families waiting in crowded company towns above the ground. Some are barely more than boys. Others have worked these seams for decades. All of them understand the quiet rules of the mine: watch the roof, trust the timber, and never ignore the smell of gas. For hours the machinery roars as it always does. Then something changes. The air grows still. In the deepest galleries of the mine, coal dust hangs suspended in the lamplight like black snow. Somewhere far down the tunnel system, a spark touches the wrong pocket of methane. The ignition is instant, too fast for any man to see, too violent for any human reflex to outrun. The explosion begins as a flash. But within a fraction of a second, the mine becomes a furnace. A pressure wave of burning gas and pulverized coal tears through the tunnels at more than 1,000 miles per hour. Timber supports snap like dry twigs. Steel carts become shrapnel. Entire sections of the mine collapse as the shockwave races toward the surface. Above ground, the town hears it. A sound like the earth itself splitting open. Then the mountain exhales smoke. And hundreds of men vanish into the dark. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States ran on coal. Before oil pipelines crossed the continent and before electricity flowed easily through modern power grids, nearly every engine of industrial life depended on the same black rock pulled from deep beneath the Appalachian Mountains. Coal fueled the locomotives that hauled freight across the continent. It burned inside the blast furnaces that melted iron into steel. It heated factories, powered steamships, and warmed millions of homes during long northern winters. Without coal, the industrial machine stopped. By 1907, the United States was producing more than 400 million tons of coal each year, an astonishing figure for a nation barely a century old. Much of that production came from a narrow belt of mountains stretching from Pennsylvania through West Virginia and into Kentucky, a region where thick seams of bituminous coal lay buried beneath layers of shale and sandstone formed millions of years earlier. These seams became the hidden foundation of American industry. Railroads depended on them. Every mile of track required locomotives that burned tons of coal each day just to keep the trains moving. Steel mills consumed even greater quantities. Inside enormous blast furnaces, coal was transformed into coke, a purified fuel capable of reaching the temperatures needed to smelt iron into steel. Without coke, the bridges, ships, and skyscrapers of the industrial age could not exist. Cities themselves depended on the mines. In winter, coal furnaces heated apartment buildings and factories alike. Municipal power plants burned mountains of it to generate the electricity that illuminated streets and drove electric streetcars through crowded urban neighborhoods. The demand seemed endless. To meet it, mining companies pushed deeper into the Appalachian Mountains, carving labyrinths of tunnels beneath forests and small rural communities. Entire towns grew around these mines almost overnight. Wooden houses, company stores, and rail sidings appeared in valleys where only farmland had existed a decade earlier. Monongah, West Virginia, was one of those towns. Situated along the banks of the West Fork River, Monongah had transformed rapidly as coal production expanded in the surrounding hills. The Consolidation Coal Company operated two enormous mines there, Mine No. 6 and Mine No. 8, connected by a complex underground network that stretched for miles beneath the mountain. Together they produced thousands of tons of coal each week. Freight trains carried that coal to steel mills in Pittsburgh, to rail yards across the Midwest, and to factories that powered the growing American economy. The output of the Monongah mines was only a small fraction of the nation's total coal production, yet the system that sustained it was vast and relentless. Every ton required men. Hundreds of miners descended into the tunnels each day before sunrise. They worked with picks, drills, and mechanical cutting machines to break coal from the seam. Wooden carts hauled the rock through narrow passages toward the surface where it would be sorted, loaded, and shipped across the country. The work was dangerous. Methane gas seeped constantly from the coal itself. Coal dust floated in the air with every swing of a pick. Timber supports held back thousands of tons of rock overhead. If any part of that delicate balance failed, the mine could transform instantly from a workplace into a trap. Yet the demand for coal did not slow. Every train leaving the yard, every furnace burning through the night, every factory machine turning inside the industrial cities of America required more fuel. And deep beneath the mountains of West Virginia, the men of Monongah continued digging, feeding the furnaces of a nation that could not afford to stop. In the narrow valley of the West Fork River, the town of Monongah grew around a single purpose: coal. The settlement had existed in small form since the mid-19th century, but its true transformation began when the Consolidation Coal Company expanded operations in the surrounding hills. By the early 1900s, two enormous underground operations, Mine No. 6 and Mine No. 8, dominated the region. Rail sidings, coal tipples, and processing yards filled the valley floor. Smoke drifted constantly above the tracks where freight trains waited to carry fuel toward distant cities. Everything in Monongah revolved around the mines. The houses belonged to the company. The stores belonged to the company. Even the churches and schools often depended on money provided by the same industrial system that pulled coal from the mountain each day. Rows of wooden homes lined muddy streets near the mine entrances, built quickly to accommodate the growing workforce arriving from across the Atlantic. Most of the miners were immigrants. Italian families arrived in large numbers during the early 20th century, many traveling from small villages where farming could no longer sustain them. Hungarians, Poles, Slovaks, and other Eastern European laborers followed the same path. They came seeking wages that, while modest by American standards, promised far more than the opportunities left behind in Europe. The mines offered work to almost anyone strong enough to descend into the tunnels. Many of the men spoke little English. In the streets of Monongah, conversations blended Italian dialects with Slavic languages and broken phrases learned from foremen or supervisors. The town became a patchwork of cultures tied together by the same dangerous occupation. Families lived close together in small wooden houses often crowded with children. A miner's pay supported not only his immediate family but sometimes relatives who had not yet immigrated or who relied on remittances sent across the ocean. Wages were unpredictable, depending on how much coal a man could produce during each shift. And the shifts were long. Before dawn each morning, hundreds of men gathered near the mine entrances carrying metal lunch pails and carbide lamps. They descended into the shafts in groups, following rail tracks and timber-supported corridors that stretched deeper into the mountain with each passing year. Inside the tunnels, daylight disappeared. The mine operated as a vast underground city of darkness and noise. Electric cutting machines screamed against the coal seam. Pickaxes struck stone in rhythmic blows. Mule drivers hauled loaded carts along narrow rails toward the shaft elevators. Above ground, the town continued its routine. Women washed clothing blackened with coal dust. Children walked to small schools built near the company housing. Shopkeepers sold food and supplies to families whose lives depended entirely on the wages earned beneath the mountain. Yet beneath this ordinary routine existed a constant awareness of danger. Mine disasters were not unknown in the coalfields. Gas explosions, roof collapses, and runaway mine carts had already claimed many lives across Appalachia. Every family in Monongah understood the risks carried by the men who disappeared underground each morning. Still, the work continued. Because coal paid the bills. Coal bought food. Coal offered the possibility, however uncertain, of a better life in a new country. And on the morning of December 6, 1907, hundreds of those miners once again walked toward the entrances of Mine No. 6 and Mine No. 8, carrying their lamps into the darkness beneath the mountain. None of them yet knew that the tunnels they were entering had already begun to accumulate the elements of a catastrophe. Coal mines appear solid from the outside. A hillside cut by rail tracks. A wooden headframe rising above the entrance. Rail cars waiting beside towering coal tipples where black rock is sorted and loaded. From the surface, the operation seems mechanical and predictable, a system of machines pulling fuel from the earth. But underground, a coal mine is something far more unstable. Beneath the mountains of Appalachia lie layers of ancient plant matter compressed over hundreds of millions of years. During the Carboniferous period, dense forests covered the region. When these forests died, their remains were buried under sediments that slowly transformed organic material into coal seams stretching for miles beneath the rock. Those seams are not empty corridors. They contain gas. Methane forms naturally during the process that turns plant matter into coal. Trapped inside the rock for geological ages, the gas remains sealed within the seam until miners begin cutting into it. Every time a drill bites into the coal face or a mechanical cutter slices along the seam, methane seeps into the air of the tunnel. In small quantities, the gas is invisible and odorless. In large quantities, it becomes deadly. Methane is highly explosive when mixed with air at the right concentration. Between roughly 5 and 15% methane, a single spark can ignite the mixture with tremendous force. Inside the confined tunnels of a mine, that ignition creates a pressure wave capable of traveling through galleries and shafts with devastating speed. To prevent this, mines rely on ventilation. Fresh air must constantly flow through the underground network of passages. Large fans on the surface draw contaminated air out while pushing clean air through intake shafts and ventilation tunnels. The moving air dilutes methane concentrations before they reach explosive levels. But ventilation systems are imperfect. Coal mining creates another hazard that ventilation alone cannot remove: coal dust. Every time coal is cut, drilled, or transported, fine particles break loose from the seam. These particles float in the air or settle along the floors, beams, and timbers of the mine. Over time, the tunnels become coated with layers of black powder as fine as flour. Under normal conditions, the dust seems harmless. Yet coal dust behaves like an industrial explosive. If a methane ignition occurs inside a dusty tunnel, the initial flame lifts these particles into the air. Suspended coal dust burns extremely rapidly, releasing heat and expanding gases that amplify the original explosion. What begins as a small methane flash can quickly escalate into a massive detonation as dust ignites through the tunnels. The effect is similar to a chain reaction. Flames travel outward from the ignition point, lifting more dust into the air with each passing pressure wave. Each ignition sends another wave racing deeper through the mine, consuming oxygen and fuel as it moves. Within seconds, the entire tunnel system can become a conduit for fire. Coal mines contain other structural risks as well. The ceilings above the tunnels are supported by wooden timbers placed carefully by miners as they advance into the seam. These timbers hold back thousands of tons of rock pressing down from above. If the supports weaken or shift, sections of the roof can collapse without warning. A major explosion multiplies this danger. Pressure waves snap timber supports, shatter rock walls, and fling equipment through the narrow passages. Collapsing tunnels trap miners while toxic gases, carbon monoxide and burning methane, spread rapidly through the remaining airways. For this reason, experienced miners develop a deep respect for the unseen forces surrounding them. They watch their lamps carefully for flickers that might indicate gas in the air. They listen for unusual sounds in the roof rock above their heads. They study ventilation doors and air currents with the awareness that their lives depend on invisible systems working exactly as intended. Yet even the most cautious miners cannot control every variable. In a coal mine, gas accumulates slowly. Dust gathers quietly. And somewhere within the labyrinth of tunnels, all it takes is a single spark to turn the mountain itself into an explosive chamber. By the early years of the 20th century, coal mining had already earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous occupations in the industrial world. Explosions were not rare events. Across the coalfields of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky, underground disasters occurred with disturbing regularity. Mines filled with methane gas had erupted before. Entire crews had vanished beneath collapsed rock. Newspapers reported these tragedies often enough that many Americans regarded them as an unfortunate but inevitable cost of industrial progress. But among the men who worked inside the tunnels, disasters rarely felt inevitable. They felt preventable. Inside most mines, the signs of danger appeared long before catastrophe arrived. Poor ventilation allowed methane to accumulate in pockets along the ceiling of tunnels. Coal dust coated walls and timber supports where it could easily ignite. Safety lamps designed to detect gas were sometimes ignored or replaced by open flame lamps that burned brighter but carried greater risk. Production always came first. Mining companies operated under enormous pressure to meet the rising demand for coal. Railroads needed fuel. Steel mills consumed thousands of tons each week. Every train waiting in the yard represented lost revenue if the mine failed to deliver its output on schedule. Supervisors measured success by the number of tons brought to the surface each day. Ventilation improvements slowed production. Installing additional airways or fans required time and money. Dust suppression techniques, such as sprinkling water along tunnels to prevent coal dust from accumulating, were known, but many mines used them inconsistently. In Mananga, the situation was no different. The Consolidation Coal Company operated one of the largest mining complexes in the region. Mine No. 6 and Mine No. 8 extended deep beneath the hills surrounding the town, their tunnels branching through miles of underground passages where hundreds of workers labored each shift. Reports from miners suggested that conditions were often far from ideal. Ventilation currents could weaken in distant sections of the mine. Coal dust accumulated heavily along the haulage roads where carts carried fuel toward the surface. Timber supports were sometimes spaced widely apart as crews pushed deeper into the seam. Yet these problems rarely stopped production. At the time, federal mine safety laws did not exist. Oversight came primarily from state inspectors who were responsible for monitoring large regions with limited resources. Inspections were infrequent and enforcement power was weak. Mining companies largely regulated themselves. The technology to improve safety was known, but it competed constantly with the economic demands of the industry. Every delay meant fewer tons of coal shipped to customers waiting across the country. Meanwhile, the workforce inside the mines remained vulnerable. Many of the immigrant miners who labored beneath Mananga had little influence over the conditions in which they worked. Language barriers separated them from company management. Economic necessity prevented most from refusing dangerous assignments. For families living in company housing, unemployment could mean eviction. So the men continued working. They descended into tunnels where methane seeped slowly from the coal seam. They cut and loaded coal while dust floated through the lamplight. They trusted that ventilation fans above the ground were doing their job, pushing dangerous gases away before they reached explosive concentrations. Most days, that fragile balance held. But coal mining is an industry where danger accumulates quietly. Gas gathers where air does not move. Dust settles where machines grind endlessly against the rock. And when the conditions inside a mine drift too far from safety, disaster waits only for a single spark. The morning of December 6th began like hundreds of mornings before it. Winter had settled across the hills of northern West Virginia. Frost covered the narrow valley surrounding Mananga, and the river carried thin sheets of ice along its slow current. Smoke rose from chimneys across the town as families prepared for another day shaped by the rhythms of the coal industry. Before sunrise, miners gathered near the entrances of Mine No. 6 and Mine No. 8. The men arrived in small groups, carrying metal lunch pails and carbide lamps that would provide the only light once they descended into the tunnels. Their boots were already coated in coal dust from previous shifts. Many spoke quietly in Italian or Hungarian as they waited beside the rail tracks leading into the mine. Some had walked from company housing along the muddy streets of Mananga. Others had traveled from nearby settlements scattered through the surrounding hills. By mid-morning, hundreds of workers had entered the mine. The tunnel network beneath Mananga had grown enormous over the years. Passageways branched through the coal seam like the roots of a buried forest. Rail tracks ran along the main haulage roads where mule-drawn carts carried coal toward the surface. Electric cutting machines were beginning their work. These early mechanical cutters had transformed the speed of mining. Rotating steel teeth sliced horizontally into the coal seam, undercutting the rock so miners could break it loose more easily with picks and explosives. The machines screamed as they worked, their motors echoing through the narrow corridors. Coal dust filled the air. Teams of miners followed the cutting machines along the face, loading broken coal into carts that would be hauled back toward the shaft. Timbermen installed wooden supports along the roof to prevent rock from collapsing into the newly opened passages. Above ground, the day continued normally. Freight trains moved slowly through the yard beside the mine tipple where coal would eventually be loaded for shipment. Women hung laundry between houses in the company town. Children walked toward school buildings near the church. Nothing in the valley suggested the catastrophe forming beneath the mountain. Deep underground, methane gas continued seeping from the coal seam. The ventilation system was designed to carry that gas safely out of the mine, drawing fresh air through intake passages and pushing contaminated air toward exhaust shafts. For hours, the system appeared to be functioning normally. But methane rarely accumulates evenly. Small pockets of gas can gather along the ceiling of tunnels where ventilation currents weaken. In long sections of the mine, dust from days of cutting had settled along the floor and beams. The fine black powder waited silently in the lamplight. Then, somewhere inside the maze of tunnels, something ignited. The precise source would never be known with certainty. It may have been a spark from electrical equipment. It may have been the flame of a miner's lamp touching a pocket of methane that had drifted into the wrong place. What matters is how quickly the reaction began. Methane mixed with air ignites with explosive force. In the confined corridors of a coal mine, the burning gas creates a pressure wave that races through the tunnels faster than any man could run. The first explosion tore through the galleries of mine number 6. Flame blasted outward, lifting layers of coal dust from the tunnel floor. Within milliseconds, that dust ignited as well, multiplying the force of the blast into a rolling detonation that surged through the mine like a storm of fire. Timber supports shattered under the shockwave. Rail cars flipped from the tracks. Sections of the roof collapsed as rock walls fractured under the sudden pressure. The explosion did not stop with one chamber. It raced through connecting passages toward mine number 8, carrying flames and burning dust into new sections of the underground labyrinth. Each ignition lifted more coal dust into the air, feeding the expanding chain reaction. Within seconds, miles of tunnels had become a conduit for fire and pressure. Deep inside the mountain, hundreds of miners had almost no warning. For most of them, the explosion arrived faster than thought itself. When a coal mine explodes, the violence does not unfold slowly. It moves faster than human perception. The ignition of methane inside mine number 6 produced an expanding fireball that traveled through the tunnels with extraordinary speed. In open air, the burning gas would have flashed and dissipated quickly. But underground, the narrow passages of the mine confined the blast, channeling its force forward like the barrel of an enormous cannon. The initial detonation was only the beginning. As the methane ignited, the pressure wave lifted layers of coal dust that had settled along the tunnel floor, beams, and equipment. For a brief moment those particles hung suspended in the air. Then the flames reached them. Coal dust burns with terrifying efficiency. Each particle contains concentrated carbon, and when thousands of tons of that dust ignite simultaneously, the reaction multiplies the power of the original explosion many times over. The burning dust became a second detonation, larger, hotter, and far more destructive. The fire raced through the mine. Flames surged down the haulage roads where coal carts normally traveled. Side galleries that branched away from the main passages became corridors for expanding gas and pressure. Every intersection allowed the explosion to spread farther into the labyrinth of tunnels. Timber supports failed almost instantly. These wooden beams had been placed carefully to hold back the immense weight of rock above the tunnels. But the pressure waves snapped them apart like dry twigs. Once the timbers shattered, sections of the roof collapsed under the weight of the mountain pressing down from above. Rock and debris filled entire passages. In other sections, the blast hurled equipment through the air. Steel carts weighing hundreds of pounds became deadly projectiles. Pieces of shattered timber slammed into the tunnel walls with enough force to splinter the wood into jagged fragments. For the miners working nearest the ignition point, survival was almost impossible. The fireball consumed oxygen as it moved, replacing breathable air with superheated gases and carbon monoxide. Temperatures surged high enough to scorch the walls of the mine itself. Anyone standing in the direct path of the blast would have been overwhelmed within seconds. But the explosion did not remain confined to one section. The tunnels of mine number 6 connected underground to the workings of mine number 8. When the pressure wave reached those connections, the flames surged into a second network of galleries where hundreds of additional miners were working their shifts. Coal dust lifted from the floors of these tunnels as well. Within moments, the detonation expanded into a chain reaction that ripped through both mines simultaneously. The underground complex had become a massive combustion chamber filled with fuel, air, and flame. Some miners may have heard the first distant rumble before the blast reached them. A sudden gust of air rushing through the tunnel. A flicker in the lamp flame. Perhaps a single second of confusion before the darkness erupted into fire. But most never had time to react. The speed of the explosion left little chance for escape. Shockwaves raced through the tunnels faster than a man could run toward the nearest shaft. Entire sections of the mine collapsed behind the advancing pressure front, sealing off exits and trapping those who survived the initial blast. Toxic gases followed the fire. Carbon monoxide filled the remaining airways, spreading through the mine like an invisible fog. Even in areas where the flames did not reach directly, the poisoned atmosphere quickly became lethal. Above ground, the explosion announced itself in a different way. A violent concussion shook the valley surrounding Mananga. Witnesses later described hearing a thunderous boom that echoed across the hills. The force of the blast traveled upward through the mine shafts, hurling debris out of the openings like the breath of a buried volcano. Timber, rock, and coal dust erupted into the cold winter air. Smoke poured from the mouth of the mine. And in the span of only a few seconds, the largest coal mining complex in the region had become a shattered maze of collapsed tunnels and burning debris. Hundreds of men were still inside. For the people of Mananga, the disaster did not begin underground. It began with a sound. At 10:28 in the morning, a violent concussion rolled through the narrow valley like distant artillery. Windows rattled in their frames. Horses reared along the muddy streets. For a brief moment the entire town seemed to pause, as though the mountain itself had taken a breath. Then the ground shook. At the mouth of mine number 6, the force of the underground explosion erupted upward through the shaft like the blast from an enormous cannon. Timber supports that lined the entrance shattered instantly. A cloud of coal dust, rock fragments, and twisted iron burst into the winter air, rising above the buildings along the rail yard. Witnesses later described seeing debris thrown hundreds of feet from the opening. Chunks of timber rained down across the nearby tracks. Pieces of mine equipment landed in the frozen mud outside the shaft. Thick black smoke poured from the entrance, rolling upward against the pale sky like the plume of an industrial volcano. Moments later, the second mine erupted. Mine number 8, connected through the underground network, expelled its own cloud of smoke and debris as the explosion tore through its shafts. The twin blasts echoed across the valley, sending shockwaves that could be felt miles away. People ran toward the mines. Women rushed from their homes, some still wearing aprons dusted with flour from the morning's baking. Children gathered along the roads, confused by the sudden commotion. Shopkeepers stepped outside to see what had happened. At first, no one understood the scale of the disaster. Explosions in mines were not unheard of. Sometimes a small gas ignition damaged a section of tunnel but left most of the mine intact. Families waited anxiously for word from the supervisors who would normally appear at the entrance to explain the situation. But no one emerged. The smoke continued to pour from the shafts. Inside the mine, the ventilation system had collapsed. Toxic gases, carbon monoxide, methane, and smoke from burning coal dust filled the tunnels. The explosion had destroyed large sections of the underground passages, sealing many escape routes beneath tons of rock and debris. Above ground, the realization spread slowly through the crowd gathering. Near the mine entrance, hundreds of men had been working underground when the blast occurred. And the mountain had swallowed them. Soon the quiet valley filled with the sounds of panicked voices calling for fathers, husbands, brothers. Some families tried to rush toward the entrance only to be held back by supervisors and guards who feared additional explosions. The mine continued breathing smoke. Somewhere beneath the frozen hills of Mananga, the tunnels had become a labyrinth of fire, collapsed rock, and poisoned air. And the men who had entered the mountain that morning were still trapped inside. In the minutes after the explosion, confusion ruled the mine yard. No one immediately knew how many men had been underground. Shift records were incomplete, and the two connected mines operated with overlapping crews moving through miles of tunnels. What was certain, however, was that hundreds of miners had entered the mountain that morning and none had yet returned. The first rescue attempts began almost immediately. Supervisors, mine officials, and volunteers gathered near the shattered entrance of mine number 6. Smoke still poured from the shaft, thick with coal dust and the bitter smell of burned timber. Pieces of broken machinery lay scattered across the yard, thrown outward by the force of the blast. Some men tied cloth over their mouths and prepared to descend. In the early 20th century, organized mine rescue teams barely existed. The specialized breathing equipment used by modern rescue crews had not yet been widely developed. Those who entered the damaged tunnels relied mostly on instinct, courage, and the faint protection offered by simple lamps. They understood the danger. After a major mine explosion, the greatest threat often comes not from fire but from gas. Carbon monoxide spreads rapidly through the underground passages, replacing oxygen with a poison that cannot be seen or smelled until it is too late. Even experienced miners can lose consciousness within minutes. Still, they went down. Small groups descended carefully into the damaged entrance, stepping over splintered timber and twisted rails. The air inside the shaft was heavy with smoke. Lamps flickered as they moved deeper into the mine, their light reflecting off walls coated in soot. The destruction began almost immediately. Just beyond the entrance, the first sections of tunnel were already blocked by collapsed rock and shattered supports. Timber beams that once held the ceiling in place had snapped under the pressure of the explosion. Coal carts lay overturned across the rails. The rescuers climbed through the debris as best they could. Further inside, the damage grew worse. The explosion had carved a path through the mine like a violent storm moving underground. Some passages were filled completely with fallen rock. Others remained open but were coated with thick layers of soot and dust burned by the blast. Then they began finding the bodies. Some miners had been killed instantly by the pressure wave. Others had been overcome by gas before they could escape the collapsing tunnels. Lamps lay scattered across the floor where the men had dropped them in the final moments before the explosion reached their section of the mine. The rescuers carried the first victims back toward the surface. Above ground, crowds had gathered in the freezing air outside the shaft. Families stood together in anxious silence, watching the entrance where the rescue teams disappeared into the smoke. Each time a group returned, people rushed forward hoping to see familiar faces. Most of the time, the rescuers emerged carrying bodies. As the hours passed, hope began to fade. The deeper sections of the mine were filled with toxic gas that made rescue work nearly impossible. Several volunteers who attempted to push farther into the tunnels collapsed from carbon monoxide before they could be dragged back to safety. Even the most determined rescuers were forced to retreat. The scale of the destruction underground had become painfully clear. Entire sections of the mine were sealed beneath collapsed rock. Other passages remained open but contained air so poisoned that no man could survive inside for long. Yet the rescue efforts continued through the day and into the night. Lanterns burned along the mine yard as volunteers and officials organized teams to search whatever sections of the tunnels remained accessible. The cold December air carried the sound of muffled voices, prayers, and quiet sobbing from families waiting for news. But as the hours passed, a grim truth emerged from the darkness beneath the mountain. Very few men had survived the explosion. As rescue crews struggled through the wreckage of the tunnels, the scale of the catastrophe began to reveal itself. Bodies were brought to the surface throughout the day and into the night. Wagons carried the dead from the mine yard to temporary morgues set up in nearby buildings. Sheets were placed over rows of victims while officials attempted the grim task of identifying them. But identification was often impossible. Many of the miners had been caught directly in the blast. Others had been buried beneath tons of rock when the tunnels collapsed. In the darkness of the underground labyrinth, entire sections of the workforce had vanished. By evening, the crowds gathered outside the mine entrances had grown into thousands. Families waited through the freezing night hoping for news that their fathers, husbands, or sons might still be alive. Women stood clutching children